You want to know the one thing that makes a narcissist apologize? The same person who once told you your pain wasn't real? It's not begging, it's not explaining, it's something far quieter and far more powerful. Because when you do this, their certainty cracks, their confidence stumbles, and they come back with the closest thing to accountability they're capable of offering. Before I unpack exactly how to maintain those boundaries without slipping back into old patterns, hit that follow and stay with me. Because this next part is where everything finally makes sense. Narcissists don't apologize out of empathy because empathy isn't the engine that drives their relationships. What drives them is supply, attention, validation, power, admiration, and control. When a narcissist hurts you, they're not evaluating the emotional impact on you. They're evaluating the impact on themselves. Did this hurt threaten their image, their comfort, their access to what they want, or their sense of superiority? If the answer is no, then there is no internal reason for them to feel remorse. Their emotional wiring prioritizes self-preservation over connection, which is why they can walk away from your pain with astonishing coldness. But the moment the consequences of their behavior begin to inconvenience them, the dynamic shifts. If you withdraw attention, stop engaging in arguments, stop trying to explain your feelings, and remove the emotional energy that once fed them, they experience a disruption in their supply. That disruption is what wakes them up, not compassion. This is why their apologies often appear only when their access to you is threatened, when you become unavailable, or when their control starts slipping. They begin realizing that their behavior has a cost, and narcissists hate paying emotional costs. Their version of an apology is transactional. It's a strategy to regain equilibrium, not an expression of understanding. When the environment around them changes and you no longer act as the emotional cushion they rely on, they perceive a risk. The risk might be losing you, losing admiration, losing stability, or losing their preferred image. To counter that risk, they may offer something resembling accountability. They're not suddenly discovering empathy. They're attempting to restore a benefit they fear is slipping away. This is why the calm withdrawal of your energy affects them more than emotional confrontation. Your lack of reaction highlights the fact that they are losing influence. And for someone who survives on control and attention, that loss is intolerable. The apology that emerges is simply their way of recovering the equilibrium that benefits them most. Your emotional withdrawal is more powerful than confrontation because narcissists are fueled by emotional intensity, not emotional understanding. When you confront them with anger, tears, explanations, or pleas for change, you believe you're communicating your pain, but what they see is engagement. Engagement means they still matter to you, still influence you, still live rent-free in your emotional landscape. This is supply, and it keeps them energized. Even negative emotions feel like confirmation that they still have control. But emotional withdrawal creates a different reality, one they are not equipped to handle. When you stop reacting, when your voice becomes calm and measured, when you stop trying to convince them of your perspective, the entire system they rely on collapses. You are no longer a predictable source of validation or emotional stimulation. You become neutral, and neutrality is their kryptonite. Emotional withdrawal isn't silent treatment or punishment. It's stepping out of the role they expect you to play. Instead of pleading, you become factual. Instead of explaining, you become concise. Instead of arguing, you preserve your boundaries and energy. This deprives them of the drama cycle that keeps them feeling superior or in charge. Narcissists need emotional reactions to maintain their psychological dominance. They provoke to keep you off balance. They criticize to make you defend yourself. They guilt trip to make you explain. When you emotionally withdraw, you deny them access to the reactions that feed their sense of power. This withdrawal forces them into an uncomfortable position. Suddenly, they're not able to read you. They can't predict you. They can't pull you back with guilt, charm, or intimidation. They can't trigger you into fighting. Your calm becomes unsettling because narcissists interpret lack of emotion as lack of control. They start questioning whether they are losing their grip on you, and that fear pushes them into behaviors they normally resist, including apologizing. They do this to reestablish emotional connection, not because they genuinely understand your pain. Your emotional distance signals that they're no longer impacting you the way they used to, and that loss of influence becomes the pressure that compels them to act differently. Boundaries work only when they are backed by consistent action because narcissists don't respond to words, emotions, or promises. They respond to outcomes. You can state a boundary 100 times, but if you continue to tolerate the behavior, the boundary becomes meaningless. Narcissists test limits relentlessly. They watch carefully to see whether your no is real or whether it can be pushed, guilted, manipulated, or emotionally worn down into a fine whatever. The moment they see inconsistency, they interpret it as permission. This is why boundaries with a narcissist must be firm, calm, and consistently enforced. Otherwise, they become opportunities for exploitation rather than protection. When you back a boundary with action, you shift the dynamic from emotional negotiation to undeniable reality. Instead of trying to convince them why their behavior hurt you, you change how you respond to it. If they yell, you leave the room. If they insult you, you end the conversation. If they cross a limit you've stated, you reduce contact or access. The key is follow through. Narcissists push because they expect you to break. When you don't, you disrupt their internal map of how to control you. Consistency becomes the shock that cracks their sense of entitlement because it shows them for the first time that their tactics are ineffective. Consistent boundaries also change you. You stop reacting from fear, guilt, or old emotional patterns. You start acting from self-respect. This creates a stable environment where you no longer reward their bad behavior with attention, emotional explanation, or engagement. Narcissists aren't used to this kind of stability. They're used to chaos cycles where they provoke, you react, and they regain control. A consistent boundary breaks that cycle. They eventually realize that certain actions lead to real consequences, whether that's distance, silence, reduced access, or the loss of influence they depend on. This realization can push them into offering apologies or making temporary adjustments, not because they truly grasp the meaning of your boundary, but because your consistency introduces a cost to their behavior. Boundaries with action force them to recognize that you are no longer the person they can easily manipulate or pull back into old patterns. A narcissist's biggest fear is losing access, admiration, or influence because these elements are the foundation of their identity and emotional survival. To them, relationships are not emotional connections, they are resources. You are a source of validation, attention, admiration, or utility. When that resource feels secure, they feel powerful. When that resource feels threatened, their entire internal world destabilizes. This is why they often behave arrogantly, dismissively, or cruelly. They assume you will always stay, always forgive, always explain, always tolerate. They rely on your emotional investment because it guarantees their sense of superiority and control. The moment that investment becomes uncertain, they feel a deep sense of panic that they'll never admit to. Losing access means they no longer have an emotional or practical hold over you. Losing admiration means they're not being seen as special or superior. Losing influence means their ability to shape your emotions and reactions is fading. These losses attack their identity because narcissists are dependent on external validation to maintain their fragile self-worth. They can't generate stability internally. Everything depends on the attention they extract from others. When you stop engaging emotionally, when you detach, when you stop responding the way you used to, you trigger their fear of becoming irrelevant. This fear often leads them to shift tactics. They may suddenly become apologetic, overly kind, or dramatically attentive. They may try to replay the idealization phase to pull you back in. Their apology is not rooted in guilt or empathy, it's rooted in fear. They sense that your emotional distance could evolve into physical distance, and that physical distance could evolve into loss of access. They apologize to re-secure their position, to keep the supply flowing, to ensure they still have a place in your mind and life. Their fear of losing influence is also why they react so strongly when you show independence, groundedness, or self-respect. To them, these are warning signs that you may no longer be under their emotional control. When admiration and access feel threatened, they experience an internal alarm that pushes them to do whatever is necessary to regain their position, including the rare moment where they offer an apology purely out of self-preservation. Calm detachment is more destabilizing to a narcissist than anger because narcissists thrive on emotional volatility and predictable reactions. When you respond with anger, hurt, or frustration, you are still feeding their system, even if it feels like confrontation. Every emotional display, whether it's outrage or pleading, confirms that they have influence over your state of mind. They interpret emotional intensity as evidence that they matter, that they still hold a position of control, and that the drama cycle continues to function as expected. Anger can escalate conflict, but it rarely produces real change because it operates within the rules of their game, a game they designed to keep you reacting. Calm detachment, however, breaks all the rules. When you detach calmly, you remove the predictable reactions that narcissists rely on to manipulate, provoke, or dominate. You create an emotional vacuum they cannot easily fill. Their usual tactics, provocation, blame, guilt, charm, stop working because they depend on a response. Without that response, the patterns that maintain their sense of superiority falter. They begin to feel confused and unsettled because the control they took for granted is no longer there. Your calm is unsettling because it signals that their influence is waning, that their emotional leverage is ineffective, and that the dynamic they rely on has shifted. Calm detachment is not passive. It is a form of strategic engagement. It communicates that you are still present but no longer accessible for manipulation. You maintain your boundaries and your dignity without providing fuel for escalation. Narcissists find this destabilizing because they are not used to resistance that doesn't provoke them emotionally. They are forced to confront the consequences of their behavior in a way that anger could never accomplish. When they recognize that their usual strategies are failing, they often feel pressure to adjust, negotiate, or even apologize, not out of genuine empathy, but because your calm removes the advantage they once had. This approach shifts the power dynamic quietly but effectively. It demonstrates that emotional manipulation no longer works, that access is conditional, and that their influence is limited. By choosing calm detachment over confrontation, You destabilize the narcissist in a way that provokes self-reflection and corrective behavior while preserving your own peace. You can't teach a narcissist empathy, but you can change the equation by changing your behavior, because narcissists operate from self-interest and need external validation rather than internal moral reflection. Their emotional framework is not designed to process the pain they cause others in a meaningful or compassionate way. Confronting them with how their actions hurt you is unlikely to result in understanding or remorse. They may nod, feign agreement, or even mimic empathy to maintain control, but genuine emotional resonance is rarely possible. Instead of trying to create empathy where there is none, the most effective strategy is to alter the dynamics that make their behavior effective. By changing how you respond, you take away the tools they rely on, forcing them to operate differently if they wish to maintain access or influence. This means removing emotional reactions that previously gave them power. It means enforcing boundaries consistently so that violations have tangible consequences. It means refusing to justify, explain, or defend yourself in ways that fuel their sense of superiority. By doing this, you shift the balance of power from them to you. The narcissist may not feel remorse in the traditional sense, but they experience discomfort, frustration, and a sense of loss when their usual strategies fail. This discomfort is what can trigger an apology or an attempt to adjust behavior, not empathy. Changing your behavior also communicates clearly that your emotional and psychological well-being is your priority. It signals that their ability to manipulate or exploit is limited and conditional. They are forced to confront the reality that the old patterns no longer work and that you will not supply the responses they rely on. In response, they may attempt reconciliation, apology, or temporary change, not because they have genuinely internalized the harm caused, but because maintaining their desired position or access now requires a different approach. By focusing on your own consistent actions, detachment, and self-protection, you create an environment where their behavior is no longer unchecked. This approach does not rely on changing who they are internally, but it changes the way they interact with you externally. Your choices dictate the new rules of engagement, compelling them to respond in ways that serve your boundaries and safety, even if empathy is entirely absent. Accountability mirrors force narcissists to see their own behavior because narcissists operate in a world shaped by self-deception, rationalization, and projection. They rarely confront the reality of how their actions affect others unless it directly threatens their self-interest. A mirror, in this sense, is not a tool for emotional confrontation or moralizing. It is a reflection of consequences, boundaries, and patterns that they cannot manipulate or ignore. When you hold up an accountability mirror, you show them what they are doing in a clear, unemotional way, without giving them the usual fuel of your emotions. You reflect behavior, not emotion, and this reflection is difficult for them to dismiss because it operates outside the chaotic back and forth they usually control. Narcissists are accustomed to narratives that serve their self-image, often bending facts, blaming others, and rationalizing actions. An accountability mirror exposes a truth they cannot easily twist because it is tied to real consequences or consistent responses. It might be as simple as consistently leaving a conversation when boundaries are crossed, documenting repeated patterns of hurtful behavior, or calmly pointing out discrepancies between words and actions. This form of reflection disrupts their usual control mechanisms because it provides clarity without emotional reactivity, something they cannot dominate through charm, manipulation, or guilt. When narcissists encounter accountability mirrors, they experience cognitive dissonance. The gap between their self-perception and the reality of their actions becomes impossible to ignore. They may initially react defensively, deny, or attempt to redirect blame, but